eyes closed. Witnesses reported seeing slight chest movements before his breathing slowed. Within 9 minutes, his body went still. He was pronounced dead at 6:29 p.m. Mitchell's final meal? Like many before him, he declined a special request and ate the standard prison meal instead. His execution reignited debates over tribal sovereignty, federal overreach, and capital punishment. But for the families of Alice Slim and Tiffany Lee, it marked the end of a long and painful legal battle. August 28, 2020, the federal execution chamber in Terre Haute, Indiana. A man lies strapped to the gurney, staring blankly at the ceiling. The 4 is inserted. The executioner stands ready, but Keith Dwayne Nelson has nothing to say. No last words, no apologies, just silence. But before we get to his final moments, let's rewind to October 1999, when Nelson committed one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. Nelson was a career criminal, a predator with a history of violent offenses. And on that fateful day, he was hunting for a victim. He found one, a 10-year-old girl named Pamela Butler, rollerblading near her home in Kansas City, Kansas. In broad daylight, he jumped out of his truck, grabbed her, and sped away. Witnesses, including her own sister, watched in terror. Pamela's family would never see her alive again. Nelson drove to a secluded spot behind a church in Grain Valley, Missouri, where he brutally raped and strangled her with a wire. Days later, police found her lifeless body. Nelson was caught within weeks and quickly confessed. In 2001, he was sentenced to death, showing no remorse for his actions. Fast forward 19 years, Nelson has exhausted every appeal. The execution is set. August 28, 2020. 4:32 p.m., the lethal injection begins. Unlike others before him, Nelson refuses to give any final words. He doesn't look at the witnesses. He simply lays still, his chest rising and falling heavily as the lethal dose takes effect. Minutes pass. His breathing slows, then stops. At 4:38 p.m., Keith Dwayne Nelson is pronounced dead. A killer who showed no remorse even in his final moments. As for his final meal, like his final words, there was nothing special about it. Nelson declined a special request and was given the standard prison meal, a final act of indifference from a man who had stolen so much. For Pamela's mother, Cherry West, the execution brought a small sense of justice, but no closure. Her daughter was gone forever. But on that summer afternoon in 2020, the man responsible finally paid the ultimate price. And this was only the beginning. More executions followed, each more controversial than the last. On September 22, 2020, just weeks after the execution of Keith Dwayne Nelson, the federal government carried out yet another execution. This time, the lethal injection of William Emmett LaCroix. His crime was one of obsession, revenge, and brutality. In 2001, LaCroix, a convicted rapist and former U.S. Army soldier, had recently been released from prison when he developed a disturbing fixation on a former acquaintance, 30-year-old Joanne Lee Teasler. Believing she had put a spell on him and caused his misfortunes, LaCroix broke into her Georgia home, lay in wait, and attacked her when she returned. He bound, raped, and brutally murdered her, slashing her throat and stabbing her in the back multiple times. After killing her, he stole her car and fled to the Canadian border, where he was quickly arrested. In 2004, a federal jury sentenced him to death. Over the next 16 years, LaCroix and his attorneys filed numerous appeals, arguing he had suffered childhood abuse and trauma, but the courts denied his requests. On September 22, 2020, his time finally ran out. At precisely 9:06 p.m., LaCroix was strapped to the gurney at the federal execution chamber in Terre Haute, Indiana. As the witnesses, including the victim's family, looked on, he was given a chance to speak his final words. "I'm really, really sorry for what I did. I'm really sorry." Unlike others executed before him, LaCroix expressed remorse in his final moments. However, for Joanne Lee Teasler's family, no amount of apology could undo the pain he had caused. As the pentobarbital was administered, LaCroix took deep breaths, blinked rapidly, then fell still. He was pronounced dead at 9:06 p.m., just 10 minutes later. And his final meal. Hours before his execution, LaCroix requested a feast of steak, fried shrimp, French fries, a soda, and a slice of cheesecake. For the victim's loved ones, the execution of William Emmett LaCroix marked the end of a long chapter of pain. But for opponents of capital punishment, it was yet another controversial case in America's return to federal executions. September 24, 2020, inside the federal execution chamber in Terre Haute, Indiana. A man lies strapped to the gurney, staring up at the ceiling. In just moments, he will become the 7th person to be federally executed under the Trump administration. But before the lethal injection is administered, he takes one last breath and speaks his final words. Christopher Andre Villalba's journey to this moment began more than 2 decades earlier, when he and his accomplices committed a cold-blooded double murder. It was 1999 when Villalba, just 19 years old, led a gang of teenagers in a brutal carjacking that ended in murder. The victims, Todd and Stacy Bagley, a devout Christian couple from Iowa, were traveling through Texas when they agreed to give a stranded teenager a ride. It was a fatal mistake.
Well, today we are also learning the final words of William Emmett LaCroix. LaCroix was executed on Tuesday at the Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary. In 2001, he was convicted of raping and killing nurse Joanne Lee Teasler. During his execution, Sister Barbara Batista with Sisters of Providence served as a minister of record. She says she received a letter with LaCroix's last words a day after his death. This is what some of that letter said.
As Arnaud Desjardins put it, the law commands us to do what we would do naturally if we only had love. The way consists of finding that love, which becomes the law. That is our goal, my final destination.
LaCroix quoted authors and philosophers throughout his letter.
Villalba and his group forced the couple into the trunk of their own car, holding them captive for hours as they attempted to withdraw money from their bank accounts. Throughout their captivity, the Bagleys prayed for their attackers, even asking God to forgive them. But forgiveness never came. Villalba shot both victims execution style, then ordered the car set on fire while they were still inside. Stacy Bagley, though fatally wounded, was still alive when the flames consumed her. Fast forward 21 years. Appeals exhausted, execution date set. September 24, 2020, 6:46 p.m. Villalba lays motionless as the IV lines are inserted. Unlike some before him, Villalba chooses to speak before his death. His final words? A prayer. He asks for forgiveness and hopes for a better world for others. "I'm ready, Father." Then the lethal dose is administered. His body jerks slightly, his breathing slows, his lips turn blue. At 6:46 p.m., Christopher Andre Villalba is pronounced dead. As for his last meal, like many before him, Villalba declined a special request. Instead, he ate the standard prison meal, a final act of quiet resignation. For the families of Todd and Stacy Bagley, justice had been a long time coming. But for many, Villalba's execution raised questions. Was a teenager capable of true reform, or was this simply the consequence of his actions? Inside the federal death chamber in Terre Haute, Indiana, Orlando Hall takes his final breaths. His time has run out. In just moments, he will become the 8th federal prisoner executed in 2020, part of a historic wave of executions under the Trump administration. But before the lethal injection takes effect, he utters his last words. Orlando Hall's story began in the early 1990s. A Texas drug dealer, he worked with a group that smuggled marijuana into the U.S. But in 1994, a drug deal went wrong. $4,700 worth of marijuana went missing. Believing a Texas man had stolen from them, Hall and his associates went after his 16-year-old sister, Lisa Renee, as revenge. They kidnapped her from her home, forcing her into a car at gunpoint. Over the next 2 days, she was held hostage in a motel, repeatedly beaten and sexually assaulted. Then they drove her to a secluded park, where they forced her into a grave and buried her alive. Hall was convicted in 1995 and sentenced to death, but it took 25 years for that sentence to be carried out. Appeals, legal battles, and last-minute challenges delayed his execution until now. November 19, 2020, 11:34 p.m. Hall is secured to the gurney as the witnesses file in. The execution has already been delayed by several hours due to legal challenges, but in the end, the courts refused to intervene. With a steady voice, Hall says his final words, addressing his loved ones. "I'm okay. Take care of yourselves. Tell my kids I love them." Then the execution begins. The lethal drugs flow through his veins. His body trembles, then relaxes. Within minutes, his chest stops rising. At 11:47 p.m., Orlando Hall is pronounced dead. Unlike many before him, Hall accepted his last meal. He chose 2 cheeseburgers, fries, lasagna, a beef taco, and a Dr. Pepper, a final indulgence before his fate was sealed. For the family of Lisa Renee, justice had finally been served. But for Hall's attorneys, his execution was a grave injustice. They argued his sentence was tainted by racial bias, as a black man sentenced to death by an all-white jury. And with that, another execution was carried out. But Hall would not be the last. Stay with us as we uncover the next case. A 40-year-old man lies strapped to a gurney inside the federal execution chamber. The needle is in his arm, and the clock is ticking. Outside, protesters hold candles, pleading for a last-minute intervention. But it never comes. This is the execution of Brandon Bernard, one of the youngest offenders to ever receive a federal death sentence in modern U.S. history. Brandon Bernard was just 18 years old when he participated in the 1999 murder of Todd and Stacy Bagley, 2 youth ministers visiting Texas. Bernard and his accomplices, 5 teenagers, lured the couple into their car, forced them into the trunk, and drove around for hours. Eventually, one of Bernard's co-defendants, Christopher Villalva, shot the couple in the head. Bernard then set the car on fire, though evidence later suggested Stacy Bagley may have still been alive when the flames consumed her. Villalva, the ringleader of the crime, was executed just months before Bernard. But Bernard's case sparked national controversy, with 5 of the 9 jurors who sentenced him later expressing regret and advocating for clemency. December 10, 2020, 9:11 p.m. Bernard enters the execution chamber. His attorneys have exhausted all appeals, and his clemency request has been denied by President Trump. His voice is steady as he addresses the family of his victims. "I'm sorry. That's the only words I can say that completely capture how I feel now and how I felt that day." At 9:27 p.m., the lethal injection begins. Witnesses say Bernard muttered a prayer as his breathing slowed. Within minutes, his eyes closed and his body stilled. He was pronounced dead at 9:36 p.m. Before his execution, Bernard was given his final meal, meat lovers pizza and a BBQ feast, one last indulgence before facing the inevitable. His case ignited a fierce debate about juvenile offenders and the death penalty. Celebrities, activists, and even jurors from his trial pleaded for a sentence reduction, arguing that Bernard had played a minor role in the crime and had spent decades rehabilitating himself. But the Trump administration refused to intervene, and with that, Brandon Bernard became the 9th federal prisoner executed in 2020. But the execution spree wasn't over yet. Just one day after Brandon Bernard's controversial execution, another federal prisoner was led into the death chamber. This time, it was Alfred Bourgeois, a man convicted of one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. As he lay strapped to the gurney, he maintained his innocence until the very end. This is the execution of Alfred Bourgeois. Bourgeois, a Louisiana truck driver, was sentenced to death for the brutal torture and murder of his own 2-year-old daughter in 2002. According to court records, Bourgeois regularly beat, burned, and abused the child after gaining custody. On the day of her death, he slammed her head against a truck window in a fit of rage, causing fatal injuries. The details of her suffering were so disturbing that the jury had no hesitation in sentencing him to death. December 11, 2020. Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary. Alfred Bourgeois is led into the execution chamber. His appeals have failed, his clemency request denied. Witnesses describe him as calm but defiant as he is strapped to the gurney. I ask God to forgive all those who plotted and schemed against me and planted false evidence. Bourgeois maintained his innocence until his last breath, even as the lethal drugs coursed through his veins. At 8:21 p.m., his body went still. The execution was officially declared at 8:29 p.m. Unlike some prisoners who make elaborate final meal requests, Bourgeois declined a special meal and was given the standard prison food on his last day. His execution, like many others in 2020, sparked debate. His lawyers argued he was intellectually disabled and should have been protected from capital punishment. But the courts disagreed, and the Trump administration carried out his sentence without hesitation. With Bourgeois' death, the federal execution spree continued, and there were still more to come. In the early hours of January 13, 2021, history was made, but not without controversy. Lisa Montgomery became the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. But her case was different from the others. Attorneys, mental health experts, and even former prosecutors argued she should never have been put to death. Yet, despite last-minute appeals and public outcry, the Trump administration carried out the execution. This is the case of Lisa Montgomery. In 2004, Lisa Montgomery committed an act so horrifying it stunned the country. She strangled a pregnant woman, Bobby Jo Stinnett, and cut the baby from her womb. She then attempted to pass the newborn off as her own before being caught the next day. Prosecutors described her as cold and calculating, but her defense argued she was a severely mentally ill woman, suffering from extreme childhood abuse and psychosis.
Lisa Montgomery has been executed at the federal prison complex in Terre Haute overnight. As we reported yesterday, she was granted a last-minute stay to evaluate her mental health, but that was overturned. The Associated Press reporting the 52-year-old was pronounced dead at 1:31 a.m. after receiving a lethal injection. This is the first time in nearly 7 decades that the U.S. government has put a female inmate to death.
As her execution date approached, her lawyers fought desperately to save her life. They argued she was not mentally competent, citing years of sexual and physical abuse that left her with brain damage and psychotic disorders. The courts disagreed, and her execution moved forward. At 1:31 a.m., she was led into the execution chamber. Unlike others before her, Lisa Montgomery had no final words. Witnesses described her as silent and motionless as she lay strapped to the gurney. The executioner began the lethal injection process, and after a few final gasps, Montgomery was pronounced dead at 1:31 a.m. On her last day, Montgomery was given a final meal request, and she chose fried chicken, potatoes, and soda. a simple choice before facing her fate. Lisa Montgomery's execution remains one of the most controversial in U.S. history. Mental health advocates condemned it, arguing that the government executed a woman who had long lost her grip on reality. But for Bobby Joe Stinnett's family, justice was served. With Montgomery's death, the Trump administration's federal execution spree was nearly over. But one more execution remained. Stay with us as we explore the final case. On the night of January 14, 2021, the federal government carried out another execution, one of the last under President Donald Trump's administration. Corey Johnson, a convicted murderer and drug trafficker, was put to death by lethal injection. His crimes were brutal, his execution was controversial, and his final words? They would leave a lasting impact. This is the case of Corey Johnson. Corey Johnson was a member of a violent drug gang in Richmond, Virginia in the late 1980s. He was convicted of killing 7 people in 1992, executing rivals and innocent bystanders alike in a wave of brutal violence. His gang, known as the Newtown Crew, was responsible for flooding Richmond with crack cocaine, leaving a trail of death in their wake. But even as his execution date approached, Johnson's lawyers fought to spare his life, arguing that he had an intellectual disability that should have exempted him from the death penalty. Despite legal challenges, his fate was sealed. At 8:11 p.m., Corey Johnson was strapped to the gurney in the federal execution chamber. As the executioners prepared the lethal injection, he lifted his head, looked around, and uttered his final words. "I am innocent. I did not kill 7 people." His breathing became labored as the pentobarbital took effect. He gasped for air, struggled for several minutes, and was finally pronounced dead at 11:34 p.m. Witnesses later reported that his execution appeared prolonged and painful, leading to further debate about the use of lethal injection. Hours before his execution, Corey Johnson enjoyed a lavish final meal. His request, fried chicken, French fries, and a strawberry shake, a meal that, for a moment, offered a brief return to normalcy before his final moments. Corey Johnson's execution reignited debates over mental disability in capital punishment cases. But for the families of his victims, the execution was a long overdue justice for the lives he took. With his death, the Trump administration's federal execution spree was nearing its end. But one final case remained. Stay with us as we cover the last execution under Donald Trump's presidency. In the early hours of January 16, 2021, the United States carried out its 13th and final federal execution under President Donald Trump's administration. Dustin John Higgs, convicted for his role in the 1996 abduction and murder of 3 women, was put to death by lethal injection. His execution was shrouded in controversy, not only because of lingering doubts about his role in the murders, but also because of the historical significance of his case. He would become the last federal prisoner executed before the administration changed hands. On January 26, 1996, Dustin Higgs and 2 friends lured 3 young women, Tangi Jackson, Tamika Black, and Mishan Chin, into a car after a night of partying in Maryland. What started as a night out turned deadly when the women were driven to a secluded area in a wildlife refuge. There, they were ordered out of the car and shot execution style. The shooter, not Higgs, but his co-defendant Willis Haynes, who later received a life sentence, while Higgs was sentenced to death for orchestrating the killings. For years, Higgs and his attorneys fought for clemency, arguing that it was unjust for him to face execution while the actual shooter was spared. But despite the legal battles and last-minute appeals, his fate was sealed.
After more than 7 hours of delays due to appeals up to the Supreme Court, Dustin John Higgs died by lethal injection at 1:23 a.m. at the Terre Haute Federal Prison.
Just before 1:23 a.m., Dustin Higgs was strapped to the gurney in the execution chamber. When asked if he had any last words, he proclaimed his innocence and said, "I am an innocent man." Witnesses described his demeanor as calm, his voice steady. Moments later, the lethal injection was administered. Higgs gasped for air, shook slightly, and then fell silent. At 1:27 a.m., he was officially pronounced dead. With his execution, the Trump administration's unprecedented 6-month execution spree came to an end. Hours before his death, Higgs was given his last meal. His choice: bone-in chicken wings, French fries, a Big Mac, a chocolate shake, and a bottle of Dr. Pepper. It was a decadent final request, in stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of the execution chamber. The execution of Dustin John Higgs left many questions unanswered. Was he truly the mastermind of the murders, or was he sentenced unfairly? Critics pointed out the racial disparities in capital punishment, as well as the historical rarity of a federal execution spree of this magnitude. But with Higgs's death, the chapter of Trump's execution legacy was closed. And just like that, an era of unprecedented federal executions came to a close. Between July 2020 and January 2021, the Trump administration shattered modern records, carrying out more federal executions in 6 months than the previous 56 years combined. It was a final push before a new administration took over, one that would reinstate a moratorium on federal executions, effectively putting the death chamber at Terre Haute into silence once again. In just 6 months, Trump's administration executed more prisoners than any former president. These executions sparked heated debates about the death penalty, justice, and presidential power. Some argued these executions were long overdue justice, while others claimed they were politically motivated. But beyond the numbers and the political debates, this was a story of real lives lost, on both sides of the execution chamber. The victims and their families who suffered unimaginable pain, and the condemned prisoners, many of whom went to their deaths still proclaiming their innocence or seeking redemption. The sheer speed of these executions raised questions that will be debated for years to come. Was justice truly served? Or was this a rushed, politically driven spectacle? Since the final execution of Dustin John Higgs, the federal death penalty has remained in limbo. President Joe Biden placed an indefinite moratorium on executions, and while no new federal executions have been scheduled, the death penalty is still technically legal. So the question remains, will executions resume in the future, or will Higgs' death be the last federal execution in U.S. history? One thing is certain, this period of history will never be forgotten. Whether you believe justice was served or injustice was done, the federal execution spree of 2020 and 2021 was a turning point, one that forced the nation to confront the dark reality of capital punishment. Regardless of where you stand, these 13 executions will remain a defining chapter in American history. But we have to ask ourselves, was justice truly served? If you found this video interesting, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime, history, and justice in America. See you in the next one.